We're going to hear now from another Robert Purdy, grandson of Bob's and son, of course, of Roger. Robert will recount for us the story of his grandfather's life.
Good afternoon. Today, we're here gathered to celebrate the life of my grandfather, Robert E. Purdy, known to most by Bob, known to several by Papa or Grandpa, known to 4 by Dad, and 1 as husband or soulmate. You see, today we gather and we celebrate what would have been his 88th birthday. Instead of celebrating his birthday, we get to celebrate his life. You see, Bob was special, and he meant a lot to people, and people meant a lot to Bob. You see, he was born on July 22nd, 1929 in Tacoma, Washington, to Mr. and Mrs. J. Edgar Purdy. He lived a highly influential life until his passing in the early morning of this past Sunday, July 16th. And during his life, he touched countless lives, as is evident by the overwhelming support that has been shown to my family over the past days and your gathering here today. As I got to thinking about it, there was a scripture that just jumped out to me that kind of just overwhelmingly talks about Bob, and I want to open with that. It says, "Choose a good reputation over great riches. Being held in high esteem is better than silver or gold." You see, I want to step back and talk about where Bob came from, because we all know her. I only know him as Grandpa in the later years of his life, but that's not it. You see, Bob overcame a lot of different trials and obstacles that made him special and made him unique as the person that we know today. You see, during this, he was born in Tacoma, Washington, and he called several places home before he finally moved to Salem, Oregon in 1939. You see, as I went through his memoir that he had written out, or that Laverne had helped him write out, I got a glimpse of who he was. You see, during the summer of 1939, he and his family, before moving to Oregon, took a cross-country trip. They visited sites such as Yellowstone, Mount Rushmore, a car factory, Niagara Falls, before making it to New York. You see, several family members, we made a cross-country trip and visited so many of those sites several years ago. They attended the World's Trade Fair in New York, and it was on that trip that his father learned that he would be the Methodist district supervisor in Salem and asked to relocate. He said they went to Washington, D.C. and West Palm Beach before traveling as many as 500 miles a day in a 1939 Plymouth, hauling a 15-foot teardrop trailer to make it back in time for him to go to work. And he recounted that there weren't any interstates and how marvelous it was how far they traveled. I can imagine that trip, if you know Bob very well, you know that he loved to travel. I would say that trip set the place for Bob, and which led to RV trips across the United States, coastal travels in boats, travels to Asia, Europe, and several other places. You see, in 1945, when he was 15 years old, his father suddenly passed away, leaving behind his mother and his 2 older brothers. Grandpa recounted that they did pretty well financially, and he made sure that he let us know they weren't rich. But his mother reached out, and she got involved in a lot of different things that she really cared for. And I believe that defined Bob as well later on, by all the boards and different places that Bob or Grandpa got involved. You see, eventually he graduated high school and started work at Standard Oil, where I believe his love for people and his ability to interact with people blossomed. You see, as we know Bob, we know that he was a storyteller. And not just a storyteller, he loved to talk about his family, and he could make anybody feel comfortable. He took pride in his job, and he said that stations were different then. We really took care of our customers' car. It was also during these years that Bob and Laverne became parents to their children, Lori, Roger, and Bobby, and Josie. You see, there were also several other foster children that called their home, or called their house home, and their love for people never ended. In 1969, he hung up his occupation in the car service industry and went to work at Equitable, working in the customer finance section. You see, also looking back, before he ever started work the second time at Standard Oil, he was a member of the United States Army and served in the Korean War. He was drafted, and he did not like to use the term drafted. He often said that he got a letter one day from his friends and neighbors calling him to report for duty. There were a lot of other things as a child. You see, Bob, he said he wasn't a great athlete, and he was good in school and good at books. He said he was always picked last. But even though I believe he still had a great love for athletics, it was shown for his children in their sports. Bob, at a very young age, he said that looking back on his life, he could see God's hand protecting him. Whenever he was set off for Korea on the ship, his eyes became bloodshot. And he saw an eye specialist, and they said that it must be the dust that was causing it, and they wouldn't put him in a war zone. And he was left to be working in the transportation corps. He said, I don't know how that was. I was on a ship. I wasn't in a dusty place, but he looked back and he said, it must have been God's hand protecting me. He finished his 18-month tour and returned to the United States. You see, in 1969, he went into the personal finance business until he retired in 1994. But as I read that, that's not who Bob was. Those were some things that he did. But who is Bob? You see, over the past several days, I've talked to people as they've come to visitation or if they have called. And while the people's names have changed and while the situations are different, every story that I hear is exactly the same. You see, he had a consistent message, and it was a love for people. You see, he loved his family more than anything. I can remember being on vacations, and Grandpa would disappear, and he'd take the truck into town just to get a few groceries. And 2 hours later, he would finally return. And he would tell us all about his friends and their name and their life story, but knowing that he also had to share his, and he bragged on his family. And if you know Bob, you know that. There's so many places that I went that people knew as much about me as I do because he was proud. This past September, I visited Oregon. And it was after he had been diagnosed with cancer and with a heart disease. And I didn't know if I'd see him again. And I caught him alone. And I said, Grandpa, what's the secret to life? You see, because I knew where he was, and looking back, he would have so much insight. And he said, number one, you have to love God. And he started talking about his faith and what his faith had meant to him. And shortly after he finished talking about his faith, and you know, Bob, he loved Jesus, and he was an incredible Christ-like figure for us to look at and imitate or emulate. And it was after he finished telling me that, he said, and the next thing, he said, love your wife. Grandma, he loved you more than anything. He said, times were tough, but I wanted my wife to be at home with my kids so that she could raise them and they could have a proper upbringing. He loved his family. And he recounted stories, but I took from that he loved God and he loved people. There's a verse that just absolutely brings this together. It's found in Matthew, chapter 22, verses 37 through 39. And somebody asked him, he said, what's the greatest commandment? And they were trying to trip Jesus up, and he stepped back and he said, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally as important. Love your neighbor as yourself. He loved people. He loved making people feel special. Written at the end of his memoir were these words. It says, I have had a good life. Good, loving parents, a great wife and kids, and the knowledge that God has and will continue to love and take care of me. You see, I oftentimes had the opportunity to travel with Grandpa. And there are going to be a lot of things that remind me of him, and there are a lot of things that are going to remind you of him. You see, maybe it might be a deck of cards. You see, Grandpa loved playing cards, and it was head and foot. And the only time that he would ever really show any kind of upsetness at somebody was in a game of cards. And he would leave it there. Oftentimes my mom said, he is so competitive, I don't think I can play with him anymore. Or maybe it's fishing. You see, we took lots of different fishing trips, and Bob, I would like to say, is set in his ways. He would always pull out a pink lady, and Bob, he only liked salmon fishing. If it wasn't a salmon, it wasn't a fish. Anybody here fish with Grandpa? Raise your hand. Perfect. And you know that. I guarantee you weren't trout fishing. He would also hunt, but he would only elk hunt, because anything else was a species that just wasn't challenging enough. He was set in his ways. But we would go fishing, and with no matter what we had to fish with, he would always fish with a pink lady. And he would only fish at high tide. And he would always have his tide book. And we'd say, Grandpa, you want to go fish? He said, no, it's not time yet. We've got about 2 hours left that we can sit here. Or maybe it's a box of Wheaties that will remind you of him. But there's going to be so many things, and just in closing, that you can take away from Bob while his body is gone and Bob is gone. His memory and his legacy will live on. And it will live on through you and through me. He was a shining example of a servant, father, husband, man, and Christ follower who will truly be missed. In closing, I want to read something, and this is a song that we sang very young in life. It's so true today. It says, Papa Purdy put the paper on the wall. He spilled a spot of paste upon us all. Now we all stick together like birds of a feather when Papa Purdy put the paper on the wall. Grandpa, you'll be missed.
Thank you, Robert. There were times during the 60s when a well-known Christian vocal artist named Norman Nelson sang in Salem. And in doing so, he gained a lifelong admirer in Bob Purdy. One of Nelson's songs became a favorite of Bob's. It was an allegorical description of how to find a consistent and peaceful inner life in the midst of tumultuous and shifting values. An allegory. So let's listen now to a recording of Norman Nelson singing Lighthouse.